Hey guys, imagine being in your own home, the place you should feel safest, only to realize that something isn't right. Something is watching you moving in the shadows, waiting. The Smurl family never knew how deeply this feeling would take root in their lives. It began with small things, whispers in the corners, the flicker of lights, an unexplained coldness that sank into their bones. The family had just moved into their home in West Pittston, Pennsylvania in the late 1970s. It was an old house full of history. But what they didn't know was that the house had a history all its own one that would soon become their nightmare. For the first few weeks, the Smurls lived in peace. But peace, as it turned out, was short-lived. It started with the smell. A foul, rotting stench filled the air, thick and suffocating, especially in the middle of the night. At first, the family thought it was coming from the drains or maybe some kind of animal trapped in the walls. But nothing could explain how the smell lingered, how it seeped into the furniture, the clothing, even the food they left out. No matter how much they cleaned, it remained ever-present, gnawing at their senses. Then came the noises. It was subtle at first, an occasional creak, the rustling of leaves outside, a whisper carried on the wind. But soon the sounds became more distinct. There were footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoing through the hallways late at night when no one was awake to walk them. The sound of scratching claws, like something trying to break through the walls, would keep them up for hours, each noise sharp enough to make their hearts skip a beat. One evening, as Jack Smurl sat in the living room with his wife Janet, they heard something they could never explain. It was a growl, deep and guttural, rising from the basement. The air grew thick and tense. Jack stood up slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for the light switch. But the basement was as dark as it had ever been, an abyss that seemed to swallow any source of light, making everything feel wrong, unnatural. "Did you hear that?" Janet's voice was barely a whisper. Jack nodded, his heart pounding. "We need to call someone." But who could they call? At this point, they weren't sure what they were dealing with. Was it an animal, a malfunction, or something far worse? That night, as Jack lay in bed, he felt the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. The house felt like it was alive, breathing, waiting. He could hear the whispers again, this time coming from the corners of the room. He could feel something close, something unseen. But it wasn't just in the room. It was inside him, something crawling under his skin, tugging at his sanity. The nights grew longer. The temperature in the house plummeted, but no one could find the source. The Smurls began to feel trapped, confined in a house that no longer felt like home. And the shadows began to move. They weren't just lingering in the corners anymore. They were shifting, creeping toward them in the dark. Sometimes they would vanish when Jack looked directly at them, only to reappear from another direction. Then one night, Janet was alone in the kitchen when the cabinet doors flew open, slamming against the walls with such force that it shook the house. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as the cold, malevolent air wrapped around her. She ran, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. Her heart raced as she pressed her hand to the door, trying to force it open. But the door wouldn't budge. As she struggled, she heard something behind her. Slow footsteps, heavy breathing, and then she felt it. A hand, cold as ice, brushed against her neck. She whipped around, But there was nothing there. But there was something. Something that had been waiting, watching. The following days were filled with dread, as if the house itself had turned against them. The Smurls sought help, reaching out to a local priest, Father Mancuso, who had been recommended to them as someone experienced in handling unexplained events. He came to the house with skepticism, but left with a newfound belief in the terrifying presence that plagued the Smurls. Father Mancuso entered the home with caution. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive, as though the walls were closing in. He stepped into the living room where the family gathered, and as he did, the temperature dropped even further. His breath became visible in the freezing air, but the furnace had been running at full blast just moments before. He began his ritual reciting prayers, trying to cleanse the house to push out whatever was lingering, but with every prayer, something pushed back. The house seemed to resist as though it had a will of its own. The whispers grew louder, and the scratching on the walls returned with an intensity that shook the foundation of the house. The family huddled together, fear creeping into their eyes. In the midst of the exorcism, something unusual happened. Father Mancuso suddenly fell to his knees, clutching his chest as if something had physically struck him. His face contorted in pain, and he gasped for air. The Smurls watched in horror as the priest was thrown backward, slammed against the wall by an unseen force. He struggled to stand, his face pale, eyes wide in disbelief. "I've never felt anything like this," he whispered more to himself than anyone else. "This isn't just a haunting. It's something darker." Despite the priest's efforts, the disturbances only grew more violent. The growls became more frequent, often so loud it rattled the windows. The family began to notice other strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, lights flickering in the dead of night, and cold spots appearing without explanation. At times, they could hear the sound of footsteps in the attic, though they never saw anyone go up there. One evening, Jack and Janet were sitting in the living room, trying to ignore the tension that had become a permanent fixture in their home. The air was thick with the smell of decay again, and the house felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, as if on cue, the lights flickered and went out. Panic seized them, but before they could react, they heard it. The unmistakable sound of a heavy breath right behind them. Janet turned slowly, her heart in her throat. But there was nothing there, except for the shadows. They were moving again, slithering along the walls, like living things. Janet's breath caught in her throat as one of the shadows began to take shape, an outline faint at first, but slowly becoming more defined. It looked like a figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, standing just beyond the reach of the light. Jack stood up, his hand trembling as he reached for the flashlight on the table. But the moment he turned it on, the figure vanished. Only the shadows remained undisturbed and still. They both stared at the spot where the figure had been, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything whole. Days turned into weeks, and the family's nerves were fraying. The relentless hauntings took a toll, both physically and mentally. Jack began to lose weight, unable to sleep, his body breaking down under the pressure. Janet couldn't stop hearing the whispers anymore. They followed her even when she went outside. No matter where she went, the chilling voices followed, constantly whispering her name. The kids were the worst off. They became withdrawn, terrified of the house, of the things they couldn't see but felt. One night, their youngest daughter, Amy, began screaming in her sleep. Janet rushed to her side, shaking her awake, but the child wasn't herself. Amy's eyes were wide, glassy, and unblinking as she spoke in a voice that wasn't her own. "He's here. He's coming." Amy muttered, her voice cold and unnatural. Janet backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to make sense of what her daughter had just said, but the only thing she could think was that whatever was in the house had now made its way inside them. It wasn't just tormenting the family anymore. It had begun to consume them from within. In desperation, the Smurls turned to Ed and Lorraine Warren, renowned paranormal investigators. The Warrens, having dealt with cases of this magnitude before, entered the house with caution, prepared for what they might find. As soon as they set foot inside, Lorraine immediately felt the presence, the weight of it. She could feel the malignant energy swirling in the air, and her instincts told her this was no ordinary haunting. Lorraine's face paled as she began to sense the spirit's malevolent intentions, and Ed, a seasoned investigator, said nothing but watched carefully, taking in every detail. They could feel the darkness creeping closer, just out of sight, watching them. The house seemed alive with something evil. As the investigation continued, they uncovered the horrifying truth. The house had once been the site of a brutal murder, and it was said that the land had been cursed long before the Smurls had moved in. The spirits of those who had suffered were trapped, feeding on the living. And what the family didn't know was that the spirit in the house was not alone. It had a companion, a demon. The Warrens performed a final exorcism, but even they knew that the battle was far from over. The evil that had taken root in that home wasn't something easily driven out. And for the Smurl family, the terror would never truly end. The exorcism performed by Ed and Lorraine Warren wasn't the end of the Smurl family's nightmare. Despite their efforts, something remained. They could feel it in the air, like an oppressive weight that never lifted. The family continued to suffer, enduring things that were too disturbing to put into words. But the most terrifying part was the lingering question: was the demon truly gone? Or was it simply biding its time? Months passed, and the Smurls tried to rebuild their lives, but they found it impossible to shake the feeling of being watched. The whispers never stopped. They'd hear them in the dark, in the corners of their minds. It was as though the house itself had become an extension of the malevolent force that haunted them, a living, breathing thing that grew stronger with every passing day. One night, Janet woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She lay still, her heart pounding as she listened. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor. She tried to call out, but her voice was caught in her throat. The footsteps stopped at her bedroom door. There was a moment of silence. Then a deep, guttural growl came from the other side of the door. Her body froze. She could feel the malevolent energy, thick and suffocating, pressing in on her. Then suddenly, the door creaked open. Not with a sound of movement, but as if it had been opened by an unseen force, a force that didn't belong to this world. Janet closed her eyes, praying it would go away, that it was just a nightmare. But the cold air that poured into the room told her otherwise. The growl came again, louder this time, and she felt something dark and powerful slip into her room. She opened her eyes, but all she saw was the blackness of the doorway. And then she felt it. A cold, clammy hand brushed her face. A cold that went deeper than the skin. It went into her very soul. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The next morning, when the family awoke, nothing seemed out of place. But the tension was thicker than ever. Jack noticed that the shadows seemed darker, more pronounced, as if the house had absorbed the terror of the night before. Even the children couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, hiding just out of reach. Father Mancuso returned to the house hoping for a resolution, but when he stepped inside, he knew. He could feel the overwhelming presence again, stronger than before. It had never truly left. The house had become a vessel for something ancient and evil. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a war. And the Smurls were trapped in the middle of it. As Father Mancuso prepared to perform yet another ritual, he whispered a prayer under his breath. He knew this time it would be different. The demon was stronger, more cunning. It wouldn't give up without a fight, and neither would he. But even as he began the exorcism, a terrible thought crossed his mind. What if they couldn't win this time? As the Smurl family stood there, their hearts heavy with fear, they realized that they were not just dealing with an entity. They were facing something far worse. A curse that had taken root in the land itself. Something that could never truly be eradicated. The demon had claimed the house, and no matter how hard they tried to fight, they were destined to live with it. And in the quiet of the night, when all was still, the Smurls knew one thing for certain. The house would never be free. No one would be free. Story 2. The Murder of Junko Furuta. Imagine the feeling of being trapped, unable to escape, as the world around you grows darker, colder. Junko Furuta, a 17-year-old girl, experienced that terrifying isolation in the final weeks of her life. The small suburban area of Tokyo, once filled with warmth, suddenly felt like a distant memory as she found herself caught in the horrifying grip of a cruel nightmare that no one could have predicted. Junko was just an ordinary high school student, living her life like so many others, unaware that her world was about to change forever. It started innocuously enough. One evening, while on her way home, Junko was abducted by a group of teenage boys, led by a boy named Hiroshi. It was an unthinkable act, the kind of thing that no one could imagine happening in a quiet neighborhood, but it did. The boys, acting on impulse and fueled by dark desires, took Junko to a house they had chosen as their own personal prison. At first, they simply held her captive, keeping her locked away in a room while they taunted her. The house felt eerily silent except for their voices, their laughter echoing in the empty space. But as the days went on, the horror escalated. Each day felt like an eternity, with the boys growing more sadistic, testing the boundaries of cruelty in ways that words could never fully describe. The cold metallic scent of fear filled the house, lingering in every corner, every crevice. Junko's body, once full of life, grew weaker with every passing moment. Her once bright eyes now seemed hollow, lost in a sea of pain and terror. The sounds of her sobs, muffled through the walls, became a constant reminder of her suffering, though no one dared to listen. What was worse than the physical torture was the isolation. Junko was alone, trapped in that house, and the world outside carried on as if nothing was wrong. No one knew what she was going through, and as each day passed, it became harder to remember a time when she had felt safe, loved, or cared for. The boys, though young, were calculating. They knew how to manipulate her how to make her believe there was no way out. Every hope, every glimmer of light she had was extinguished in an instant. They fed her lies, forced her into submission, until she no longer recognized herself. The girl who had once smiled brightly and lived with a future ahead of her had been replaced by a broken shell. But even in her darkest moments, there was something inside Junko that refused to let go. She fought back in her mind, holding on to the memories of who she had been, though the physical world around her had become unrecognizable. And still, the torment continued. She was beaten, starved, and subjected to unfathomable cruelty. The sound of her heart beating faster with each passing day was drowned out by the sound of the boys laughing, mocking her helplessness. Every tear that fell from her eyes was a silent scream that echoed in the hollow rooms of that forsaken house. The days blurred into weeks, the torment escalating with a terrifying regularity. Junko's body, once strong and full of life, now bore the marks of unimaginable suffering. Her face, swollen and bruised, had lost all resemblance to the young girl she had been just a few weeks before. But even as her physical form deteriorated, her spirit still clung to some fragile semblance of resistance, a faint glimmer of hope that refused to be extinguished, though she knew in her heart that escape was impossible. The boys, Hiroshi and his friends, seemed to grow more intoxicated by their power with each passing day. They had no remorse, no sense of guilt. What had started as a cruel but somewhat isolated act of violence became an elaborate game, for them a game in which Junko was nothing but a helpless pawn. They continued to subject her to unspeakable horrors, taking turns in tormenting her, pushing the boundaries of cruelty to uncharted depths. One of the most horrific acts was the repeated sexual assault, which left Junko physically and mentally shattered. They would beat her for the slightest provocation, forcing her into positions that left her body trembling, unable to fight back. And through it all, the one thing that kept Junko holding on to whatever fragment of humanity she had left was the thought that someone, anyone, might find her. That perhaps someone would see the signs, the bruises, the desperation in her eyes. But no one came. The boys had no fear of detection. They knew they had control. The house was isolated, far from the prying eyes of the neighborhood. Their friends, who came and went, were complicit in the horrors that unfolded. No one asked questions, no one suspected anything out of the ordinary. And with each passing day, the sounds of Junko's cries faded into the walls of the house. It was as though the house itself had swallowed her anguish, amplifying it until even she could not recognize the person she had once been. There were moments, fleeting moments, when the torment would stop and she would be left alone in the room, curled up in the darkness. In those moments, Junko would close her eyes and try to escape into her memories. She would remember the smell of her mother's perfume, the way the sun felt on her skin when she would walk home from school, the warmth of her friends' laughter. Those memories were her only refuge, her only connection to a world she had once known. But even those moments of peace couldn't last. The terror would always return. And then one night, things took a final, irreversible turn. The boys, growing bored with their sick game, decided to take it even further. They took turns using cruel implements, forcing Junko into even more degrading positions. And when they were finished, they left her in a pool of her own blood, barely conscious, her breath shallow and labored. She had no strength left. Her body had endured more than it could ever be expected to. Her skin was covered in cuts, bruises, burns, each one a testament to the hell she had been trapped in. She could no longer remember what it felt like to be human. She had become a shadow, a broken reflection of the girl she once was. But through it all, the boys showed no sign of remorse. It had become a sickening ritual, one in which they derived pleasure from every inch of her suffering. They mocked her pleas for mercy, laughed at her brokenness, and yet, in the silence of the night when the room was empty, a terrifying realization began to seep in. Junko had become nothing more than an object of their twisted desires. And in the depths of her agony, she realized that there was no escape. There would be no rescue. No one would ever know the extent of what she had endured. Her soul had already begun to fade, and with it, any chance of reclaiming the life she had lost. On the last night of her life, as she lay in that room, gasping for breath, something inside Junko finally gave way. She surrendered to the darkness that had taken hold of her body and mind, a darkness that had been there all along, but had never been able to fully claim her until now. The once vibrant girl was gone, her spirit broken beyond repair. When the police finally arrived, the house was eerily silent. The boys had long since disappeared, leaving behind nothing but the nightmare they had created. And though the truth of what had happened to Junko Furuta came to light, it came too late. She had already become a part of the shadows, a silent witness to a horror that no one should ever endure. Her story became a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the faces of those who are meant to protect us of the evil that can grow unnoticed in places we never expect. The pain of Junko's loss would never fully dissipate, lingering like a haunting and indelible mark on the world that would never fade. Story 3: The Dyatlov Pass Incident. Picture yourself standing on a frozen mountain, the wind howling through the trees, biting at your skin. The air so cold, it feels like it's pressing down on your chest. You're far from civilization, surrounded only by white snow and shadows. Now imagine this: a group of 9 hikers, strong and determined, venture into the wild, unaware that they will never return. The Dyatlov Pass Incident, one of the most chilling and unsolved mysteries in history, begins here. It was the winter of 959, in the Ural Mountains of Russia. A group of experienced hikers led by Igor Dyatlov set out for what should have been a routine expedition. Their goal was to reach Otorten, a mountain in the northern Ural region, but they would never make it. Their bodies were found scattered across the slopes in a manner that defied all logic. The hikers had planned to trek through snow-covered peaks and rugged terrain, an adventure that would challenge their endurance. They had been to these mountains before, and they knew the dangers of the cold, the snow, and the isolation. Yet there was something about this trip that felt different, something unsettling that the hikers couldn't put their finger on. As the days passed, the group made slow progress, their footprints disappearing in the thick blanket of snow behind them. On the night of February 1st, the group set up camp in a small sheltered ravine on the slopes of Kolat Shakal, a mountain whose name translates to Dead Mountain. The campers cut into the slope, hoping to find protection from the bitter wind. Their tent was carefully secured, but something about the night felt off, like the mountain was watching them. After the hikers failed to send a telegram, as scheduled, a rescue team was sent out. They found the group's tent eerily abandoned, its door slashed open from the inside. This alone was strange. Why would the hikers cut their way out of the tent in such a hurry, abandoning their belongings, some of them without shoes or adequate clothing? Even though the temperature was well below freezing, the search continued, and as days passed, the first body was found. One by one, the bodies of the hikers were discovered scattered around the area in strange positions. They were far from the tent, seemingly trying to flee, yet there were no signs of struggle. As the rescuers uncovered more, the story grew stranger. Two hikers, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko, were found by a cedar tree, their bodies stripped of clothing, as though they had been trying to warm themselves against the freezing cold. The lack of clothes suggested they had been disoriented or worse, in a frenzy. Nearby, their footprints led back to the tent, but they had not returned. The others were found further up the slope, but the scene felt wrong. There were signs of blunt force trauma and inexplicable injuries that seemed out of place for a simple accident. Then, there were the inexplicable signs that sent shivers down the spines of those who investigated. Some bodies had their tongues and eyes missing, and in one case the face had been mutilated, as though something had eaten away at it. The oddities kept piling up. There were theories ranging from an avalanche to a wild animal attack, but nothing seemed to fit. And then there was the blood-curdling idea that the hikers might have encountered something far more unnatural. As the investigation dragged on, authorities were left with more questions than answers. Why were the hikers so terrified? What had caused them to abandon their shelter in the dead of night? And what could explain the bizarre injuries? The mountain kept its secrets, its icy grasp refusing to release them. As the investigation continued, the eerie silence of the mountains seemed to swallow every clue. With each passing day, the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass deepened. No one could explain why the hikers had fled from their tent so hastily, and the injuries they sustained only added layers to the enigma. Some bodies showed signs of blunt force trauma, with fractured skulls and broken ribs, while others had wounds that seemed too precise to be caused by an accident or an animal attack. It was the discovery of one body in particular that left the rescue team speechless. The body of Zenaida Kolmogorova, one of the hikers, was found several hundred meters from the others. Her face was frozen, her eyes wide open in shock. But the most disturbing part of the scene was her hands. She had been clutching a piece of fabric, something that looked like a torn section of the tent, as if she had been trying to escape. But her body was in a position that suggested she had been dragged, or worse, chased. What could have forced her to run? The most chilling detail came when the bodies of Igor Dyatlov and his companions were found. Dyatlov's body was discovered near a small ravine, his limbs bent unnaturally. His face had been scratched, and his eyes, those wide, terrified eyes, were frozen in a look of sheer horror. But there was something even more unsettling. Dyatlov's body was partially covered in snow, as if something had buried him in a hurry. The others were found in similar conditions, each with signs of violent death and an overwhelming sense of dread hanging over them. But the most puzzling of all were the missing eyes and the severed tongues. How could this happen to experienced hikers who had been trained to survive in the harshest conditions? And why would their bodies be left in such unnatural positions as if they had been manipulated by an unseen hand? As the investigation drew to a close, theories began to emerge, though none could truly explain what had happened. Some suggested an avalanche, but there was no evidence of snow buildup around the area, and the bodies were not buried by snow. Others speculated that a wild animal, perhaps a bear, had attacked the group, but the lack of claw marks or bite wounds seemed to rule out that possibility. A few even whispered about the possibility of a military cover-up, with rumors of secret tests or encounters with something unnatural on the mountain. But it was the local folklore that seemed to offer a more chilling explanation. The Ural Mountains were known for the strange, mysterious legends, stories of spirits, ancient curses, and forces that defied explanation. Some believed that the hikers had unknowingly ventured into a forbidden area, a place cursed by the spirits of the mountain. In the darkness of the night, they had unwittingly awakened something ancient, something malevolent, and it had come for them. As the years passed, the Dyatlov Pass incident faded from the public eye. But for those who had ventured into the mountains or studied the case, it was clear that the truth had never been fully uncovered. The hikers, once full of promise and excitement, had been consumed by something that no one could explain. Their bodies were returned to their families, but the memories of that night lingered on, haunting those who dared to speak of it. And in the cold, desolate expanse of the Ural Mountains, the wind still whispers, carrying the lost voices of the Dyatlov group, forever searching for answers, forever lost in the shadows of the mountain that claimed them. The mountain still holds its secrets, and some believe that one day it may claim more. Story 4. The Hinterkaifeck Murders. Imagine the isolation of a farm, deep in the woods, far from any town, where the only sounds are the creaking of trees and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. It's eerily quiet, and the chill of the autumn night settles in like an uninvited guest. For the Gruber family, the Hinterkaifeck farm was their world. But for them, the quiet would soon become the haunting backdrop to one of the most gruesome murders in German history. The family lived on the Hinterkaifeck farm, situated in a remote part of Bavaria, far from the bustling towns and villages. The farm was old, built on land that had long been steeped in superstition and whisperings of the unnatural. The Grubers had lived there for generations, but there was always something strange about the place. Something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up when you walked the narrow paths that led to it. And then one night in March 1922, the silence shattered. On the evening of March 31st, the Gruber family, consisting of the father Andreas, his daughter Victoria, his son-in-law, and their children, had disappeared. The farmhands who had arrived the following morning to tend to the animals noticed the first signs of something wrong. The animals were unattended, and the house was ominously still. Inside, the family's bodies were discovered all brutally murdered in their own home. The crime scene was chilling. The victims, including Victoria and her children, had been killed with a pickaxe. Their bodies were found scattered in various rooms, and yet there were no signs of forced entry. The doors and windows were locked from the inside. A strange thing was happening. The house had been lived in, but there were no signs of struggle. And even more unsettling, the murderer, appeared to have stayed in the house for several days after the murders. The residents of the nearby village were horrified. But as the weeks dragged on, with no progress from the police, something even stranger began to unfold. People began to hear rumors that the house was haunted, that it was cursed, and that something otherworldly had taken the lives of the Gruber family. The police searched the farm and surrounding woods, but they found no footprints in the snow, no clues to lead them to the killer. As the investigation continued, rumors of a strange figure lurking around the farm emerged. Neighbors reported hearing strange sounds coming from the house, like someone walking around inside, but when they called out, no one would answer. It became clear that someone or something was living in the abandoned house. And even more unsettling, they seemed to be waiting. Then something more chilling happened. People in the village began to find traces of food being taken from their homes. Milk, bread, and other supplies were disappearing, but there were no signs of a break-in. The townsfolk speculated that whoever had committed the murders was now living among them, hiding in plain sight. And as each day passed without an arrest, the fear grew. The police, still baffled by the lack of evidence and any clear motives, began to suspect that the killer was someone they already knew, perhaps a family member or someone with intimate knowledge of the farm. But the deeper they dug, the more the mystery deepened. The family had no known enemies, no deaths, no reason for anyone to target them. And yet the haunting presence of the killer seemed to hang over the farm like a shadow that could not be shaken off. The Grubers had lived in isolation, but now their home had become a beacon for dark forces. Something terrible had happened at Hinterkaifeck, and the question remained, who had done it and why? As the weeks turned into months, the mystery of the Hinterkaifeck murders deepened further, leaving the small Bavarian community in a grip of unease. Despite extensive investigations and multiple theories, the killer remained elusive. Yet there were strange events that seemed to suggest the presence of an unknown figure still lingering in the farm's shadow, as if the house itself had become a dwelling for the dead. The police were growing increasingly frustrated. The crime scene had been methodical. The murderer had known the layout of the house, the rooms, the paths, the hiding places, as if they had been watching the family for some time. What was even more disturbing was the lack of evidence, no signs of any forced entry. There were only the bodies left behind in a macabre display, their souls seemingly trapped in the house, unable to rest. The killer's chilling behavior was confirmed when neighbors reported a series of strange occurrences. At night, some villagers swore they saw a figure lurking near the farm, walking around the house, disappearing into the shadows. And then there were the sounds, the eerie creaking of the house at night, like footsteps moving from room to room when no one was there. People from the village, too frightened to investigate, started locking their doors and windows at night, as though the curse of the Grubers had somehow infected them all. And then, the strange behavior of the animals on the farm. The Gruber's dog, which had been left behind, was discovered acting erratically. It was growling at empty spaces, barking at shadows, and refusing to enter the barn. Something had disturbed the balance of nature on the farm, something unnatural. But no one dared speak it aloud. The possibility that the Gruber family had not been alone in their final days, that perhaps their killer had stayed lurking in the very walls of the house. Months passed, and then a breakthrough came. A witness came forward, a young maid who had worked at Hinterkaifeck a few weeks before the murders. She claimed she had seen a mysterious figure walking around the house, a man with strange wild eyes and a look that was both haunting and unsettling. She described him as someone who had appeared out of nowhere, someone who didn't quite belong. The description matched no one the police could identify, and it only deepened the mystery. Was this the killer? Or was it something else? Someone who had come to claim the land? In the weeks following, rumors started to spread, fueled by fear and paranoia. Some villagers believed that the spirit of the Grubers had never left the house, and that they were now trapped in a cycle of torment, forever reliving the night of their deaths. Others whispered of a dark figure, possibly the ghost of a previous owner or someone who had once worked on the farm, now seeking revenge. But there was one other possibility that seemed too terrible to consider. What if the killer was still hiding within the house, living in secret, feeding off the fear of those around him? No one could say for sure. The police had no leads, no suspects, just the growing legend of the farm that now felt more like a prison. Years later, the Hinterkaifeck farm was abandoned, left to crumble in the face of its grim past. The house, overgrown with vines and forgotten by time, still stood as a silent witness to the horror that had unfolded. No one dared to live there again, and as the wind howled through the trees, it seemed as though the land itself had become cursed. The murders remained unsolved, and the dark presence that had once haunted the Grubers lingered forever, tied to the farm. Perhaps the truth would never be known. Or perhaps, in the stillness of the night, the answer was already there, hidden in the whispers of the wind, carried through the cracks of an old house where the shadows never fully leave. And maybe, just maybe, the killer was still out there, waiting for the next family to come too close to disturb the silence and find themselves lost to the curse of Hinterkaifeck. Story 5. The Black-Eyed Children. Imagine it's late, well past midnight. The silence of your home is almost too perfect, the kind of quiet that presses in on you. The only sound is the occasional creak of the house settling the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then you hear it, a knock. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent, coming from your front door. You stand frozen for a moment, the warmth of your home suddenly feeling distant. Who could be out there at this hour? No one you know would dare disturb you in the dead of night. Hesitantly, you make your way to the door. Peering through the peephole, you see nothing but the vague outline of two children standing in the darkness, barely visible in the dim street light outside. It's strange, something about their presence sends a cold shiver down your spine. You take a deep breath, trying to steady yourself. Children. Maybe they're lost. Maybe they're just trick-or-treating at the wrong time. You reason. You open the door a crack, just enough to speak through. But the moment the door moves, you feel the temperature drop sharply. A sense of unease settles into your bones as you look at them more closely. Their faces are pale, too pale. Their eyes unnaturally dark. So dark they seem to swallow the light around them. You can't make out the whites of their eyes at all, only pitch black orbs that stare at you with an intensity that feels like an invasive force. Can we come in one of them? asks the voice, a little too calm for children, too hollow. It's not a question you would normally hear at this hour. Not one that feels innocent. "It's cold out here," the other adds, as if on cue, though the air doesn't feel cold to you. You swallow your throat dry. Something feels terribly wrong, but you can't pinpoint it. You've heard stories of kids knocking on doors late at night, begging to be let in, but never like this. You hesitate, your hand still gripping the door handle, not sure whether to let them in or slam the door shut. Their voices are odd, too polite, almost rehearsed, as if they've said these words 100 times. And yet they don't seem to know what to say next. They stand there, waiting for your response, unmoving like statues. Your mind races, thoughts colliding. Why are they alone? Why have they come here? You glance around the dark street, but there's no sign of parents, no one else in sight. Just the two of them, standing silently, their gazes locked on yours. For a moment, it feels like they're not even children at all. The air around you grows thick with tension, the kind of pressure you feel before a storm. You feel as though they're not simply asking to come inside, they're waiting for something. They need something. And you realize deep down that whatever that something is, it isn't good. "Can we come in?" They ask again, a little more insistent. This time, though, their voices haven't changed. It's a command, now not a request. You want to slam the door and run to the safety of your phone call for help, but your legs feel heavy, like they've been rooted to the floor. There's something in their gaze, something that draws you in, makes your mind go fuzzy, as though your will is slipping away. "Please," they say in unison, their black eyes never blinking, their faces too still, too perfect. We're cold. The silence between you grows thick, suffocating. You don't know why, but you feel a compulsion to open the door wider, to let them in. You fight it, heart pounding in your chest. Something tells you that if you do, you might never escape. But before you can react, the moment is broken by the sudden sound of a car driving past its headlights, briefly illuminating the yard. You snap back to your senses, the fog in your mind clearing just enough to realize how wrong the situation feels. The door is still cracked open, but your hand tightens around the handle. No, you can't do it. With a final glance at them, you pull the door back, shutting it with force, locking it. Your breath comes in quick, shallow gasps as you step away from the door, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on you again. Outside in the dark, the children remain standing, their black eyes still staring through the window, unblinking. For a moment, you almost think you see them smile. But when you look again, they are gone. You try to shake off the lingering sense of dread as you back away from the door, but it sticks with you. The image of their eyes, dark and endless, keeps haunting your mind. You tell yourself it was just a bizarre encounter, a prank maybe. After all, it could have been any number of things, delusional kids, a harmless trick. Still, something gnaws at the back of your mind, something you can't explain. You try to push it aside and get back to your evening, but the house feels colder now, emptier, as though the walls are closing in on you. You lock every door and check the windows, even though you know no one can get in. But you still feel eyes on you that wait in the room, as though someone or something is watching from the shadows. You move to the kitchen, trying to distract yourself, but then the knock comes again. This time it's louder, more urgent. almost like a pounding. It seems to echo in your head, vibrating through your bones. The knocking is rhythmic, like a signal, like they are calling you. You freeze, standing still in the center of the kitchen. Your mind races. Should you answer? Should you even go near the door? The words they said ring in your ears. Can we come in? You can't shake the memory of their gaze. How they stood unmoving. How their voices were strange, calm, almost mechanical. You find yourself drawn back to the door. Maybe it's the quiet outside, the emptiness of your house, but you feel an odd pull toward them. Something is telling you that you need to open the door, that the world is waiting for you to do so. Your feet move on their own as you approach, slower now, hesitant, but you can't stop. The door handle feels cold under your fingers as you reach for it. You hesitate. Should you open it again? No, you know you shouldn't. You step away from the door, a wave of nausea overtaking you. But the knocking doesn't stop. It's louder now, insistent, as though the children on the other side are angry. Then suddenly, it goes silent. A silence that is so complete, it feels suffocating, like the air has been sucked out of the room. But then the worst part, there's a voice. It's a whisper, so soft, so close. It feels like it's coming from right behind you. Let us in. You spin around, heart racing, but there's no one there. The house is empty still, save for the dark corners that seem to stretch farther than they should. Your breathing is shallow now, the weight of their presence lingering. You're not sure if you've imagined it, if it's just the fear running wild in your mind. But you know deep down that whatever that was, it was real. The children are still out there waiting, watching. The knocking starts again, louder this time, shaking the doorframe. You can feel it in your chest, like the pounding is coming from inside your heart. They're still out there on the other side, and their voices are growing clearer, more insistent. Let us in. Over and over they chant their voices, blending together, growing in pitch. It's not a request anymore. It's a command. The pressure builds, making it harder to breathe. Then, without warning, the door rattles violently, shaking as if someone is pushing against it from the other side. You stumble back, eyes wide, heart pounding. You glance toward the windows. Darkness has swallowed the yard. There's nothing outside but the blackness of the night, and yet you know. You know they are still there. A final bang on the door, then silence, and then something shifts in the atmosphere. It's almost imperceptible, but the temperature drops. You feel it crawling along your skin, like icy fingers tracing your spine. Your mouth goes dry and you turn to face the door again. And in that moment, the unease in your chest turns to terror. A soft, familiar tapping starts, like fingertips drumming on wood. But it's not coming from the door anymore. It's coming from the window. You slowly turn your head, unable to stop yourself. Your heart thuds loudly in your chest as you meet those eyes again, those black, endless eyes staring at you from the other side of the glass. Two children standing still, unmoving in the darkness. Their faces are pale, expressionless, but their eyes are locked onto yours, unwavering. You try to scream, but no sound comes out, and as the silence stretches, you realize you should never have answered. You should never have opened that door. The children, they aren't asking anymore. They're waiting for you to let them in, and the question that lingers in your mind is what happens if you don't. Story 6. The disappearance of the Sodder children. Picture this. It's Christmas Eve 1945, and a small house in the hills of West Virginia is filled with laughter. The Sodder family parents, George and Jenny, are gathered with their children, enjoying the holiday together. The crackling of the fire and the soft glow of the Christmas lights fill the room with warmth, a sense of comfort that most families cherish. But outside, the wind howls, a cold reminder of the harsh winter pressing in from all around. The night, like so many others, before it begins to fall into its quiet rhythm. The children are excited, tucked into bed, dreaming of presents to come. But that night, something is wrong, and none of them knew it yet. As the clock strikes 10 a.m., something happens that will forever alter the course of their lives. A fire starts in the basement. The fire is fierce, roaring through the small house, racing up the stairs, engulfing everything in its path. George and Jenny wake to the sound of crashing and the acrid smell of smoke. Panic sets in. The fire is spreading so fast, there's no time to think. George and Jenny scramble to get to their children. They run into the hallway, shouting their names, trying to wake them, but the smoke is too thick, too overwhelming. In the midst of the chaos, a nightmare begins to unfold. 4 of their children, who are sleeping in their rooms on the second floor, are somehow pulled from the fire. They escape through the front door, coughing and gasping for air. But when George and Jenny look back, they realize 3 of their children are missing. The fire department arrives hours later, and the house is reduced to ashes. There is no trace of the 3 missing children. No bodies. No clues. The fire seems to have consumed everything, yet strangely, the children's rooms were untouched. The fire didn't burn where they should have been. The authorities are baffled. No one can understand how the children could have disappeared without a trace. Their rooms were locked from the inside. The walls of the house, even though they had been scorched, bore no signs of forced entry. It was as if the children had simply vanished into thin air. The fire had claimed everything, but not them. It was a mystery that seemed to defy all logic. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the mystery deepened. Jenny and George, desperate for answers, began to investigate on their own. They received letters from people across the country, some offering condolences, others with strange theories. But one letter in particular caught their attention. It was from a woman who claimed to have seen their children alive weeks after the fire. She said they had been spotted in a car heading out of town with a group of strangers. The woman's letter was cryptic, and while George and Jenny were willing to believe any lead, this one seemed too strange to ignore. They contacted the police, but the investigation was slow to progress. The town seemed to close in on itself, the secrets buried deep in the dark corners of its streets. With each passing day, the sense of something more sinister began to grow, a feeling that they were being watched, that there was something just out of reach, something that didn't want them to find their children. Jenny, heartbroken but determined, returned to the burned-down home, clinging to the hope that somehow, some way, she would find them. But when she stood in the charred ruins, the wind howling around her, the sense of unease grew. The place felt wrong. It was as if the house, now nothing more than a skeletal frame, was hiding something. Something that wasn't just fire. Jenny stood in the ruins of the house, her breath visible in the cold air, as she gazed at the remnants of what had once been a home full of life and laughter. The broken beams of the roof and the charred remains of furniture seemed to whisper something to her, a faint echo of the past, but nothing was clear. The air smelled of ash, and yet there was a strange lingering odor, almost sweet, like something rotting beneath the surface. The house had been burned beyond recognition, but something still seemed to be lingering, as though the fire had not fully consumed everything. Jenny's mind raced. What if the children weren't lost in the fire after all? What if they had been taken? The more she thought about it, the more the sense of dread crept up her spine. What if someone had been in the house before the fire started waiting, watching? And what if just maybe they had been the ones to light it to cover their tracks? As she stood there, a cold gust of wind swept across the field behind the house, making the hairs on her neck stand up. She looked toward the woods, where the shadows seemed to move unnaturally. It was so quiet, the kind of quiet that felt suffocating. Jenny felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, the pressure of knowing her children were out there somewhere, but no one could help her find them. Even the authorities seemed more interested in the fire's origin than in the disappearance of her children. But Jenny couldn't stop. She couldn't give up. She felt it in her bones. Her children were alive. Someone knew something, and she would find them, even if it meant doing it alone. Over the next few weeks, Jenny followed every lead she could find. There were whispers in town of strange sightings and odd figures, seen late at night figures, who seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. People in the small town of Fayetteville began to look at her with suspicion, their faces guarded when she asked questions. The air felt heavy, like something was being hidden, something no one wanted to talk about. One night, as Jenny was walking through town, a man approached her. His face was pale, and his eyes looked as though they had seen too much. He handed her a small crumpled envelope, his hands trembling. Without saying a word, he disappeared into the darkness before she could even ask who he was. The letter inside was chilling. It described a sighting of her children, but it also warned her of the people who were involved in their disappearance. A shadowy group, one that operated in secrecy with strange rituals tied to the land. The letter detailed a series of locations deep in the woods, abandoned places where the townspeople never ventured. The writer claimed that these places were where the children had been kept, that they had been taken for a purpose, for something far more sinister than anyone could comprehend. The letter spoke of strange ritualistic acts performed in the dead of night of people who had vanished without a trace, of families torn apart by a secret that no one dared speak. The words on the page burned into Jenny's mind. She felt sick to her stomach, but there was no turning back. The clues were there, hidden in the darkness, and she had no choice but to follow them. The path ahead was dangerous, and the closer she got to the truth, the more she felt the shadow of something dark following her, always just behind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jenny followed the directions in the letter, her footsteps crunching on the snow as she made her way into the woods. The trees loomed above her, thick and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened. She knew she was close. Suddenly she saw it, an old shack hidden behind thick underbrush. Its windows were boarded up, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. It looked abandoned, but Jenny's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward. This was it, the place from the letter, the place where her children had been taken. She hesitated for only a moment before pushing open the door, which creaked loudly in the stillness. Inside the shack was cold and dark, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, and she could make out shapes in the corners of the room. Old crates, rusty tools, and strange symbols carved into the walls. And then she saw it. A figure standing motionless in the center of the room, its back to her. A faint hollow sound came from it, like whispers or breathing. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence, but she felt its gaze on her, cold and unyielding. Jenny's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, her instincts screaming for her to leave, but her legs wouldn't move. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing against her chest, and in that moment she understood. The mystery of her children's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy. It was part of something far darker, something tied to the land, to the very soil beneath her feet. And as she turned to flee, she heard the whispers, louder now, echoing in the corners of the shack. The wind outside howled, as though it too was warning her, but Jenny knew. She had just discovered the truth. And it wasn't the truth she had wanted to find. Story 7, The Skinwalker Encounter. Imagine you're deep in the forests of the American Southwest, the air heavy with the scent of pine and dust. It's late, and the sky is a deep indigo stars scattered across the endless black. You're far from any town, surrounded only by the rustling of leaves and the crackling of a campfire. The silence of the night is thick, almost oppressive, and something feels wrong, as if the forest itself is holding its breath. The fire flickers, casting long, trembling shadows that stretch into the darkened woods. You've been out here for days now, with no sign of civilization in sight, just the sound of the wind and the occasional animal. It's peaceful, almost too peaceful. And then just as you begin to relax, the quiet is broken by a sound. A distant howl. It's not quite like any animal you've ever heard before. A strange, eerie call that sends a chill creeping up your spine. You glance around the camp, feeling the unease settle into your gut. The howl comes again, louder this time, closer. The hairs on your neck stand on end. You've been hearing things like this for days now, but tonight it feels different. It feels too close. You stand up, your eyes scanning the perimeter of your camp. The fire flickers in the breeze, throwing shadows on the trees. For a moment, you think you see something move, a shape just out of the corner of your eye. You squint, but it's gone as quickly as it appeared. The wind picks up, carrying the scent of something musky, almost rancid with it. You pause, trying to calm your racing thoughts. You've heard the stories, of course, the old tales about the Skinwalker, the shape-shifting creatures from Navajo folklore that are said to roam these lands. They're supposed to be legends, but as you stand there, the cold of the night creeping into your bones, the stories don't seem so far-fetched anymore. You shake your head, trying to clear the thought. There's no way. It's just the wind, the call of an animal, something natural. Still, the unease gnaws at you, and you take a step back, reaching for the rifle you left leaning against a tree. The wind howls again, and then, for a split second, you hear something else. A rustling. a low guttural sound that doesn't belong to any animal you know. You turn sharply toward the noise, your heart hammering in your chest. And there it is, a figure standing just beyond the light of the fire, barely visible in the darkness, a shadow among shadows. At first, you think it's just an animal, maybe a coyote or a stray dog, but then it stands up too tall, too unnatural. It's too big. You freeze your breath, catching in your throat. The figure tilts its head, and for a moment you swear you see glowing eyes reflecting the firelight. The figure steps closer, its shape shifting as it moves. Its gait is wrong, like something human, but not quite. It's walking on two legs, but its movements are jerky, too fluid, as if it's struggling to stay in one form. You can hear the crunch of leaves beneath its feet, but the sound is muffled, as though the creature is trying to move quietly. But it's not quiet. The air grows heavy, thick with a presence that makes your skin crawl. The creature is almost within reach now, and you can make out its features, but they're not right. The eyes, though glowing, are too wide, and the mouth, when it opens, reveals far too many teeth. The face, it's not quite human. It's distorted, as if someone had tried to craft a man out of shadows and bone. But the result is something horrifying, unnatural. You raise the rifle, your hands trembling, but you can't bring yourself to shoot. There's something in its eyes, something that pulls you in, that paralyzes you with fear. It takes a step closer, and you can smell it now, a rancid, foul odor, like something decaying, something that should never have walked this earth. It stops. Not a foot from the fire, not a sound, not a breath. The wind shifts again, and for a split second, you think it might speak. But then, the creature does something that sends your blood running cold. It smiles. The grin stretches unnaturally wide, its lips cracking, revealing a mouth full of sharp yellow teeth. A laugh, low and guttural, echoes in the night air. It's not a human laugh. It's something else, something that makes your stomach churn. The sound wraps around you, pulling you in, squeezing the breath out of your lungs. And then in a flash, the creature darts back into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as it had come, leaving you standing there, frozen, unable to move. The laughter lingers in the air, echoing in your mind as the fire crackles, now somehow smaller, as though the flames have been drained of their warmth. The night feels different now. The wind feels colder, the shadows deeper. Something has changed, and you're no longer alone. The silence that follows is suffocating. Your heart thunders in your chest, and your breath comes in shallow gasps. You clutch the rifle knuckles wide, but you don't dare lower it. The shadows around the fire seem to grow, stretching out like dark fingers, reaching for you, and you can feel the eyes of the creature on you even though it's no longer visible. You stand motionless, not sure if you should stay or run, not sure which option will keep you safer. The sound of your own heartbeat is the only thing you can hear, thumping in your ears, too loud, too steady. You strain your ears, but the rustling of the trees, the crackling of the fire, everything seems distant, muffled, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Then, out of the corner of your eye, you see movement. It's quick, darting across the darkness just at the edge of your peripheral vision. You whirl around, rifle raised, your body tense and ready. The hairs on the back of your neck stand up, every muscle screaming for you to run, but your legs are frozen, unwilling to move. You scan the trees around the camp. The stillness is almost suffocating, the only sound now the wind as it sweeps through the branches above you. And then you hear it again. A low guttural growl, a sound that vibrates deep in your chest, resonating with something primal in your core. It's not far off, but it's not coming from any direction you expect. The creature isn't just hiding, it's circling you, watching you. The growl cuts through the air again, and your breath catches in your throat. It's close. Too close. You take a shaky step back, the rifle trembling in your hands. The creature's silhouette flashes in the distance once more, this time much closer. Its shape flickers in and out of the shadows like something caught between two worlds, neither fully human nor fully animal. You think you see its eyes again, glowing faintly before it disappears behind a tree, vanishing into the night like smoke. A sudden burst of noise erupts, the sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush, followed by the snap of branches. It's coming straight for you, fast and relentless. You spin toward the sound, your finger tight on the trigger, but nothing prepares you for what happens next. It steps into the firelight. It's not the same creature as before, or perhaps it is. But now it's different. Its face is still distorted, its eyes blacker than the night around it, but its shape has shifted. The limbs are longer, almost human in appearance, but the movement is unnatural. It lurches forward, jerking its head toward you, the smile once again stretched wide, too wide to be natural. Its mouth opens, and the stench of decay floods your senses, thick and choking. The air grows colder still, and as it steps closer to the fire, it lets out a low, unnerving chuckle, the sound hollow and echoing. You feel it in your bones, a sensation like ice crawling under your skin. "Why don't you let me in?" it whispers. The voice is thick, rasping, almost familiar. It sounds like a man's voice, but twisted, distorted, like something that's been pulled out of your nightmares. You feel a flicker of recognition, like you've heard that voice before. But where it doesn't matter. What matters now is that you're no longer just facing an animal. You're facing something far worse. You realize too late that this creature, this Skinwalker, has been playing with you from the very beginning. Your heart races, the instinct to survive kicking in as adrenaline floods your system. You raise the rifle, but your hands shake too violently and your aim wavers. The creature watches, still smiling, its face eerily calm. You pull the trigger. The shot rings out in the stillness of the night, echoing through the trees. But the creature doesn't flinch. It doesn't even move. It laughs again, deep and throaty. "You think that will stop me?" It hisses, its voice turning to a growl. "I've been here long before you." You back away, eyes never leaving the creature's form, but your feet feel heavy, sluggish, like they're sinking into the earth beneath you. The creature takes another step forward, and you know, without a doubt, that there's nowhere left to run. Its grin widens as it closes in, and the darkness around you seems to close in with it, suffocating, choking out the light. Then, without warning, it lunges. But just as quickly as it came, the moment is interrupted by a sudden howl. A real howl this time, from deeper in the woods. The creature freezes, its face twitching with a flash of recognition, its eyes flicking to the source of the noise. The howl is louder now, closer. Another creature, and another. The Skinwalker snarls its attention, divided between you and the approaching howls. Then, in a blur of motion, it turns and vanishes into the trees, disappearing into the night as quickly as it had appeared. You stand frozen, the rifle still raised, eyes wide, heart pounding in your chest. The howls continue rising and falling, as if calling to each other. You're left standing there, alone, shaken to your core, with the knowledge that whatever hunted you that night was not alone. The forest is no longer silent.